Let's start. Let's start.
Hello. Today I will tell you about the interaction between indigenous people and oil companies on the North Slope of Alaska. I have done this research for 4 years, since 2015 until 2019, and published an article in the Sustainability Journal. My lecture will be short, but all details you can find in my article. The North Slope of Alaska is populated by Inupiat indigenous people, and these people have to share the space, the waters with extractive industries. These people are involved in mammal hunting, mostly whaling, but also caribou hunting, and they are also involved in cash economy. And this cash economy is and both their traditional activities and their economic activities are affected by oil companies, and I will retell how. If we look at the map of the North Slope of Alaska, we see here the Prudhoe Bay, which is the National Petroleum Reserve, the major petroleum reserve in the United States. Here is the Alaska National Wildlife Reserve. And maybe you know that the fight for this reserve started very long ago, for more than 20 years, and it was opened by President Trump. Here, there are lots of polar bears, and very close, the village of Kaktovik, which is also affected by oil and by this closeness of the Alaska National Wildlife Reserve. I was doing my case studies in 3 villages, in Kaktovik and in Nuiqsut, which is very close to Prudhoe Bay, and in Nuiqsut, which was called Barrow before, and is a regional municipality. Nuiqsut is affected mostly by ConocoPhillips and Kaktovik by ExxonMobil. The North Slope of Alaska has very, very complicated governance structure, and it is multi-layered. As everywhere in the United States, there are federal and state governments. Then there is North Slope Borough, which is indigenous-run municipality. And this municipality was created just to keep oil money locally. In Alaska, there are native corporations, both regional and village corporations. The major regional native corporation is Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, and village corporations are located in every village. All native corporations have economic power, but very few political power. And there are also tribal governments in each village, and they have, on the contrary, political power. They interact with the other governments, government-to-government negotiations, but they don't have resources. In general, tribal governments are much more interested in subsistence activities and traditional economic activities, and much less interested in oil development. On the contrary, native corporations and the North Slope Bureau are interested in development, and they are welcome oil companies. Plus, there are city governments, which care usually about local issues in the villages. With this complicated structure, it is very hard to make any decisions about wildlife management, or about development, or about economic activities. There are lots of negotiations, but always lots of contradictions and conflicts during these negotiations. In my lecture today, I will focus on benefit sharing. Benefit sharing is a commitment by companies to channel returns back to communities. And it can be in monetary return or non-monetary return in different ways. And I will tell you about the whole range of benefit sharing and how it is all organized. So my major research question in this research was, what are the benefit sharing arrangements in Alaska, and to what extent they are equitable? And I was distinguishing between procedural and distributional equity. In ideal world, the benefit sharing arrangements between oil companies and indigenous communities need to be fair and equitable, of course, and they need somehow to close the gap between extractive industries, global beneficiaries, and local residents. But in practice, benefit sharing arrangements depend on many issues. They depend on existing legislation, and I will explain how. They depend on what global standards are and what are the transnational corporations' commitments to these standards and what standards they adopt. Then they depend on practices in use. Local contexts are very important, and also local empowerment of indigenous people is important. I was trying to do grounded research in several regions of the Arctic, many in Russia, 5 regions in Russia and 1 in Alaska. And in a grounded way, I was trying to just kind of figure out what are the modes of benefit sharing. And I have done classification of them. So now I distinguish the paternalistic mode, company-centered social responsibility mode, partnership, and shareholder in Alaska. I will explain what does it mean. In paternalistic mode, the state dominates. It defines, monitors, intervenes in life of communities. And there are very few participation. There is participation, but it is pretty much formal. Governments organize different consultations, but they usually don't hear the voices. And they themselves decide what to provide, how to provide for communities, and they decide what really community needs, even if the voices say something, people say something different. The second mode is company-centered social responsibility. Because each company, especially a transnational corporation, has its own strategy of corporate social responsibility to be a good neighbor. But in my classification, I underline company-centered social responsibility. This means that I don't look at the social responsibility in general, but look in what social responsibility activities companies are really interested to participate. And usually they are interested to adhere to the rules which help them to be the good neighbors in communities and to satisfy global, national and regional stakeholders. But they try to do this efficiently in a minimum way. They respect rights of indigenous people, of course. They pay compensation for damage to indigenous communities, but they try not to do as much as they can. They try to do just to satisfy stakeholders. The next mode is a partnership mode. Just partnership mode is more about giving opportunities for development to indigenous people, helping their self-reliance, and just more equal than paternalistic mode. In Alaska, we see this kind of partnership mode in the interaction between transnational corporations and native corporations, because both are business actors, and for them, partnerships are easier than other ways of interaction. And finally, I will tell about shareholder mode, which is very important for Alaska. First, in Alaska, maybe you know, there is Alaska Permanent Fund, which gives money every year to any resident in Alaska who lives more than half a year. And it depends upon an economic situation, is around like a little bit more or a little bit less than $1,000 per year. But if a family has 5 or 7 children, it is pretty significant. But I will concentrate mostly on shareholder mode, which originates from the Alaska Native Claim Settlement Act, UNCSA. This is a very important legislation which affects benefit sharing in Alaska very severely. As you know, the United States bought Alaska from Russia, and that's why the property on land was not really defined before this Alaska Native Claim Settlement Act. According to this act, Indigenous people on the North Slope could, in Alaska, could choose 44 acres of land from 90 million of hectares and get title. This legislation was alternative to reservations. And this legislation gave a significant sum of money for lost land as a compensation. And they gave it to native corporations. So village corporations received the surface rights on land, and regional corporations received both surface and subsurface mineral rights. Theoretically, I told you about, in my theory, about all these modes: paternalistic, company census, social responsibility, partnership, shareholder, and plus there is a mixed mode in Alaska. Plus, I distinguish principles of benefit sharing, which can be compensation, can be investment, and can be charity. And there are mechanisms of benefit sharing. Mandated mechanisms are those which are required by legislation, negotiated, that are decided between different parties. Semi-formal, those which kind of are based on rules in use, they are expected to be implemented. And trickle-down are those that company, for example, builds a road for themselves for transportation, and Indigenous people also use it. Or they create a dormitory for workers, and Indigenous people come to use the restaurant in this dormitory. And I looked at participatory and distributive equity. Participatory equity is to what extent people can really participate and decide on benefit sharing. And distributive equity is about justice in distribution of different benefits. I will look at different actors and explain their role on benefit sharing. First is the North Slope Borough. It was formed in 1972, and it is a very large political subdivision in the United States. And it is run by Indigenous people, by Inupiat people. And it was created mostly for keeping money locally. And because this North Slope Bureau has responsibility to tax property on oil infrastructure. I showed you the map of Prudhoe Bay, and you saw, and there in Prudhoe Bay, there is lots of oil infrastructure. So even if prices on oil go down, infrastructure is still there. So North Slope Bureau keeps this money anyway in the North Slope of Alaska. And then the North Slope Bureau is responsible for planning and development of the North Slope. And they welcome oil companies, and they do at the same time wildlife management in the region. The North Slope Bureau is the largest employer. So in every villages, there are lots of, all government employees are employed by the North Slope Bureau, as well as schools, kindergartens, playgrounds, everything, sports centers. And it is the largest supply of resources to the villages, responsible for all infrastructure in the villages. But what was surprising to me, the interaction between the governance structure of the North Slope Borough and local people is very paternalistic. Citizens in the villages respect the North Slope Borough as the major source of funding. And they, of course, appreciate infrastructure. But infrastructure is old, it is decaying, people would like it to be fixed, but the North Slope Borough is more interested in a big project, some new airports, for example, for Kaktovik, or big facilities. And they usually don't hear voices about repairing infrastructure, moving it. Then people complain that decisions on large projects are done only by the North Slope Borough and Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, by economic powers, and local voices are not heard. Villages, of course, receive a lot. They would not survive there without the North Slope Borough. But their desires are not really fulfilled. It is very top-down decision-making, and there is a lot of corruption. If we talk about transnational corporations, as I told you, this is a mixed mode of benefit sharing. It's a mixture of shareholder mode, partnership mode, company-centered social responsibility, and paternalism. As I told that the transnational corporations are taxed by North Slope Borough, so they contribute a lot to the North Slope Borough. In this way, they contribute to paternalistic mode. And their own interaction with indigenous people is also pretty much paternalistic. They feel that they kind of understand what people need and they try to do their best. Then with native corporations, it's partnership mode. Then they have commitments on company sense social responsibility in implementation of different kind of standards to which they adhere. So they express company-centered social responsibility. And then the major is their contribution to shareholder mode, because transnational corporations contract native corporations, and then native corporations distribute shares to local communities, to indigenous communities. Here, all mechanisms and all principles of benefit sharing are represented, but there are many shortcomings, both in participatory and distributive equity. I can provide some examples. Transnational corporations adhere to pretty much the same global standards, and they have the same benefit sharing strategies if we talk about the whole North Slope. They all support STEM education. They all support schools, and they all support community initiatives. This is investment principle. Then they have specific programs for different villages. For example, ExxonMobil brought back cultural artifacts to Alaska. They were in big museums, and citizens were upset that they cannot really see their own cultural artifacts. So ExxonMobil brought it back to encourage and organized tours to encourage for local people to see this national heritage. Then they helped to install ice coolers, which is very, very important for community, because somewhere whale meat need to be stored for the whole, taken from these ice coolers when needed. And ConocoPhillips sponsored like a playground, school run, and usually companies respond on demand to communities. There are special people employed in local communities as intermediaries. They collect different wishes from local communities, and transnational corporations respond to them. The most important actors in Alaska are native corporations. There are 13 regional corporations and 208 village corporations. 13th corporations receives monetary compensation, but they don't have land because indigenous people don't live in Alaska. It is a special corporations for those people who moved away. Regional corporations, according to the law, have to share revenue with other regional and village corporations who don't have access to oil. And they need to share 70% of their income, which is coming from oil. If, for example, a regional corporation have business in other parts of the United States, they don't have to share with other regional corporations. And Arctic Slope Regional Corporations has the most access from all to oil money, to oil resources, so they have to share with others 70%. Native corporations have members. Each indigenous person who was born before 1971 received 100 shares each. And to get this 100 shares, you need to be quarter blood. It is a very complicated issue here because what we do with children who are born after 1971. I will retell about that inequalities and issues a bit later. Indigenous people don't really like the law, Nuiqsut law, and they call it divide and conquer strategy of the Congress. Just because of these inequalities between those who were born before 1971 and after. They call those who were born after 1971 afterborns. Inequalities come also because from native corporations' income. Some of them are very profitable like Arctic Slope regional corporations, but others are not. The shares, that 100 shares which were given, can be inherited or gifted. So future generations get less and less because families are of large size. Regional corporations usually decided to share with children, to give shares with, to children as well. But village corporations decide not to. And that's why intergenerational inequalities are very sharp in village corporations. And inheritance can be done not equally to children. Sometimes grandmothers just decide that the child was not helping at home or was smoking marijuana, they don't give them shares. To others, they give more. So young people fight for shares in front of their own grandparents. And this causes lots of local issues. I will retell a little bit about how it is all going on, benefit sharing issues and interactions in two villages, which I studied in Nuiqsut and Kaktovik, and I will start with Nuiqsut. In order to form the North Slope Borough, there was a need of certain amount of villages on the North Slope, and one was missing. So the North Slope Borough decided just to set up another village in order to be able to tax all infrastructure, and they formed Nuiqsut. Nuiqsut, a new horizon, was formed in a place where nomadic communities were doing their hunting. So kind of native lands, and lots of people wanted to return to these native lands just to be closer to nature, far from the city, and they organized a tent city. So in between the 1974 and 1975, 30 houses were built there, and they were sponsored by Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, which gave money for that. And then a Kupik Corporation, which is a village corporation in Nuiqsut, paid off this money later. So housing were free for people. And the North Slope Borough set up all infrastructure gradually. But what happened? People were moving there because they wanted to be on their native land, far from oil, far from the city. But they turned to be surrounded by ConocoPhillips infrastructure and very severely affected. There is lots of respiratory diseases which are not confirmed by medical doctors, but just worded by people. Because in all my interviews, people were talking about these respiratory diseases and dust and pollution. Then Kupik Village Corporation decided not to give dividends to afterborns. And this created lots of issues. Lots of manipulations by elder people with their children, lots of jealousy between families. For example, husband and wife born before 1971 receive around $50,000 per year without working, just because as dividends. And their married brother, who was born after, like a year after, receives nothing. That's why there is a lot of kind of fights for money, lots of contradictions in communities, but the flow of money in general is just huge. Nuiqsut gets the most of money from the state, from there are federal programs, there is lots of support from transnational corporations, and there are dividends, but there is no happiness. So it is absolutely unclear how to build sustainability in such community as Nuiqsut. And I would say that I traveled a lot in Russia, in different communities in the north, and in Nuiqsut I saw the most affected and the most unhappy people, which are much more, how I feel, much more unhappy than in the polluted villages in Russia. The next small case study is Kaktovik. This is also whaling, hunting, fishing community, very small, but what is interesting about Kaktovik, they have polar bear tourism. Because polar bears, of course, are on the whole North Slope, but here are more polar bears because the Arctic this Alaska Wildlife Refuge is very close. And plus, community decided to keep bones from the whales just there, less than a kilometer from the village. And that's why lots of polar bears come every September. And they are coming there since 2011, and every year, earlier and earlier, because of climate change, polar bears become hungry and they are waiting for food. So they are coming earlier and earlier. This village has a quota for 3 whales, but the village is very small, so they cannot really eat all these 3 whales. And in August, their ice coolers are usually still filled half with the whale meat, so they just bring this meat to the bone pile, and polar bears, before the new bones are placed there, are eating these leftovers of whale meat. The Kaktovik community has pretty good relationship with ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil operates in Point Thompson, which is offshore and 60 miles from communities. That's why there is no harsh issues between the company and local communities. But there are harsh issues between the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and community. And this happens because the Kaktovik Inupiat Corporation owns land, surface land, just inside the refuge. And Congress kept it closed for a very long time, but opened in 2017. So now oil if President Biden will not close it again, can be extracted and native corporations can benefit. And community is very much divided. Part of the community wants oil to be extracted close to the village, and other part, especially those involved in polar bear viewing and tourism, are against that. And I would say it's half and half. In general, Kaktovik people are much more happy than Nuiqsut because they are not surrounded by oil. And they look at Nuiqsut with fears. The most of people are afraid of this future oil development, but some of them, especially native corporations, are eager to start development. In general, citizens feel that land and decision-making is taken from them. Just because Congress decides everything, then transnational corporations decide, North Slope Borough decide, ordinary citizens do not decide. So the community is divided, there is lots of tensions. Lots of people come there, like senators, tourists, state agencies, and people react differently on them. They are tired of them. Then certain people benefit from polar bear tourism, but those who are involved in whaling hate polar bear tourism because for them, they are whaling. They don't want tourists to photograph just the whales on the shore. They worry that environmental organizations will be against whaling, and they are not interested in tourists at all. And they ask tourists not to come to the shore. But when whale is on the shore, it is impossible to keep tourists out. Everybody goes there and see how traditional people are dealing with this whale and how it's taken from the waters and how it is cut and how polar bears are sitting around and waiting for bones. So community transforms a lot. So you see this polar bear on the garbage pile just because people, indigenous people who have cars like to do just kind of to show polar bears inside the village. And sometimes polar bears are not inside the village. So they open the gate and some polar bears come to the garbage pile and then they take tourists there. So of course it is very destructive practice with polar bears, and I'm sorry for polar bears, but that's what happens, what cash economy is doing and stimulating such behavior. So just to conclude, I was telling you about benefit sharing arrangements and participatory and distributive equity, and we see that both participatory and distributive equity is very far from being perfect. There are some good practices here and there, but there is lots of pitfalls. And what is really needed is benefit sharing co-management between indigenous people and other actors. But it is very hard to figure out how to do this. So it's kind of an open question. It's just maybe in future, it is possible to figure out how to do this, but for now, it is not. Thank you for your attention.